In 1943, the strategic balance in the Mediterranean theater forced both Axis and Allied powers to reassess their positions. Following the defeat of Axis forces in North Africa in May, the Allies sought to exploit their momentum by invading Europe's southern flank. Sicily appeared the most obvious target, located less than 160 kilometers from the Tunisian coast, within range of Allied air power, and offering control of sea routes through the central Mediterranean. The island was defended by a garrison of more than 3,000 German and Italian troops, supported by coastal artillery, airfields, and fortified positions. For the Allies, seizing Sicily promised to open the way into Italy and potentially force its government out of the war. The German High Command anticipated that an Allied landing in southern Europe was imminent. Adolf Hitler and the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht examined possible invasion sites, including Sardinia, Corsica, Greece, and the Balkans, as well as Sicily itself. Assessments were complicated by limited intelligence and uncertainty over Allied logistics. While Sicily appeared the logical choice, the Germans were wary of deception, aware of the Allies' use of disinformation during earlier campaigns in North Africa. Within the Allied leadership, questions of strategy were also debated. Prime Minister Winston Churchill favored an invasion of the Mediterranean as a way to pressure Germany indirectly and exploit Italy's vulnerabilities. American commanders, including General Dwight D. Eisenhower, accepted this approach but stressed that success required careful planning, given the risks of heavy casualties and the possibility of strong Axis reinforcements. To improve the chances of success, Allied planners sought to mislead the Germans about the true target of their next offensive. British intelligence organizations played a central role in these preparations. The 20 Committee, responsible for coordinating deception operations, had overseen the double-cross system of using captured German agents as conduits for misinformation. In early 1943, two officers in British naval intelligence, Lieutenant Commander Ewan Montague and Flight Lieutenant Charles Cholmondeley, developed an unorthodox plan to misdirect German attention away from Sicily. Their concept involved planting false documents on a corpse dressed as a fictitious British officer to be discovered by Axis intelligence. The documents would indicate that Greece and Sardinia, not Sicily, were the intended invasion targets. The context for such a plan was shaped by precedents. During 1942, Allied deception had successfully influenced Axis deployments in North Africa by using false radio traffic and misleading troop movements. However, Operation Mincemeat, as the new scheme became known, represented a different scale of ingenuity, relying on the credibility of physical documents carried on a supposed courier. Its success depended on German intelligence accepting the material as authentic and altering their deployments accordingly. The geopolitical stakes were high. If the Germans concentrated their defenses in Sicily, the Allies faced a difficult amphibious assault against heavily fortified positions. If, however, German forces were drawn to other regions, Allied landings on Sicily could achieve surprise and encounter weaker resistance. For Hitler, the possibility of Allied landings in Greece threatened vital oil supplies from Romania and control over the Balkans. For Churchill, success in deceiving the Germans could reduce casualties and accelerate Italy's withdrawal from the war. Public sentiment in Britain and the United States was focused on anticipation of the Second Front in Europe, though details of planning were kept secret. German propaganda warned of an impending Allied attack somewhere in southern Europe, but claimed Axis readiness. Civilians in Sicily, Greece, and Sardinia braced for possible invasions, with local populations already enduring air raids and shortages. The broader context of Operation Mincemeat thus combined strategic imperatives, intelligence innovation, and civilian uncertainty, setting the stage for one of the most unusual deception operations of the Second World War. The opening phase of Operation Mincemeat unfolded in early 1943, as British intelligence began to transform an unconventional concept into a workable deception scheme. The central idea was to create the identity of a fictitious British officer who would appear to have drowned at sea while carrying top-secret documents. These documents, deliberately planted, would suggest that Allied plans targeted Greece and Sardinia, diverting attention away from Sicily. For this ruse to succeed, the execution required precision, attention to detail, and careful anticipation of how Axis intelligence would respond. The first challenge involved acquiring a suitable body. A human corpse was necessary to give the plan credibility, but the cause of death had to be consistent with drowning and subsequent immersion in seawater. After consultation with pathologists, British intelligence obtained the body of a man who had died from ingesting rat poison, which caused pneumonia-like symptoms. This was deemed suitable for creating the appearance of a victim who had perished at sea. The body was kept under careful conditions until it could be prepared for deployment. The creation of the fictitious identity was the next stage. The man was given the persona of Major William Martin of the Royal Marines, a rank and position considered plausible for a courier carrying sensitive materials. To reinforce authenticity, naval intelligence developed a wallet litter of personal effects. Photographs of a fiancé, personal letters, theater ticket stubs, and a receipt from a London jeweler. These details were designed to withstand close German scrutiny, presenting a believable picture of an officer's private and professional life. Every item was cross-checked for consistency with wartime conditions in Britain. Attention then turned to the documents themselves. 2 carefully prepared letters were drafted between senior Allied commanders. These communications suggested that the Allies intended to invade Greece and Sardinia, while Sicily was mentioned only as a diversion. The documents were placed in a briefcase attached to the body by a chain, simulating the method by which officers often secured classified papers. The assumption was that, once the body washed ashore, local authorities would pass the documents to the Germans through Spanish intermediaries. Spain was chosen as the operational site due to its neutrality and the presence of strong German intelligence networks. Although officially non-belligerent, the Spanish authorities were known to share materials with the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence. By arranging for the body to wash ashore near Huelva, where German agents were active, British planners increased the likelihood that the false documents would be intercepted and forwarded to Berlin. The naval component of the plan was assigned to HMS Seraph, a British submarine under the command of Lieutenant Norman Jewell. In late April 1943, the submarine departed from Scotland, carrying the corpse in a specially designed container filled with dry ice. On 30 April, near the coast of Huelva, the crew released the body into the sea, ensuring it would drift ashore. A life jacket and flotsam were included to reinforce the impression of a plane crash at sea. Reactions to the discovery unfolded rapidly. Spanish fishermen located the body and notified local authorities. The corpse, still carrying its briefcase, was examined by Spanish officials before being turned over to German contacts. The Germans, well aware of Allied operations in the Mediterranean, considered the documents highly valuable and immediately arranged for them to be photographed and transmitted to Berlin. This opening phase marked the moment when a theoretical deception entered the sphere of reality. The Allies could only wait to see if the Germans accepted the material as genuine and whether troop deployments in the Mediterranean would shift accordingly. The success or failure of the entire operation now depended on the chain of custody in Spain and the decisions made by German intelligence in evaluating the find. The strategic goals and planning behind Operation Mincemeat reflected the broader Allied effort to mislead Axis High Command at a critical moment in 1943. The invasion of Sicily, codenamed Operation Husky, was scheduled for July, and its success depended not only on amphibious capabilities, but also on reducing the concentration of German and Italian forces on the island. Allied planners recognized that a direct assault against a garrison of over 3,000 Axis troops, supported by coastal artillery, airfields, and mobile reserves, would be costly. Strategic deception was therefore elevated to a vital component of the campaign. The overarching deception framework was known as Operation Barclay. It aimed to convince Germany that the Allies intended to invade southern Europe through the Balkans and Sardinia rather than Sicily. Operation Mincemeat was conceived as a subset of this wider plan, providing tangible proof of false intentions. By presenting documents that appeared to originate from authentic British sources, Allied intelligence hoped to exploit German anxieties about the Balkans, particularly their fear that Greece, with its vulnerable coastline and proximity to Romanian oil fields, would be targeted. Logistics for Mincemeat demanded precise coordination. The 20 Committee, which oversaw deception operations, worked closely with the Royal Navy, the Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, and the Special Operations Executive. The documents placed on the corpse had to be convincing not only in their content, but also in their physical characteristics. Paper stock, typewriters, and ink were carefully chosen to match genuine military correspondence. Even the signatures of senior officers, including General Sir Archibald Nye, Vice Chief of the Imperial General Staff, were reproduced authentically. The inclusion of informal notes and personal touches was intended to strengthen credibility by reflecting real communication practices within the Allied command. German intelligence procedures were also studied in detail. The Abwehr often relied on intercepted documents and cultivated close ties with Spanish authorities, particularly in regions where Axis sympathizers were influential. Huelva, the chosen landing site, was notable because the German vice consul there, Adolf Klaus, had a well-established intelligence network. British planners anticipated that once the body was discovered, Spanish officials would discreetly share the documents with Klaus, who would then forward them to Berlin. For the deception to succeed, it was essential that the Germans believed the material had been obtained without British knowledge, giving it the appearance of an accidental loss rather than deliberate planting. Miscalculations were an inherent risk. If the documents were judged to be a fabrication, the Germans might suspect that Sicily was indeed the true target, thereby reinforcing defenses there. Alternatively, if the documents were delayed or mishandled in Spain, they might not reach Berlin in time to influence strategic decisions. The Allies calculated that even partial success, diverting some reinforcements toward Greece or Sardinia, would still reduce the scale of opposition on Sicily. Propaganda considerations also played a role. For the Germans, credible evidence of Allied intentions to strike in the eastern Mediterranean would validate Hitler's long-standing belief in the vulnerability of the Balkans. German propaganda had emphasized the importance of defending southern Europe against British influence, and confirmation through apparent captured documents would align with these narratives. For the Allies, no public acknowledgement could be made, as secrecy was paramount. Only a handful of senior figures, including Churchill, were aware of the operation's details. The planning stage underscored how intelligence and military strategy were increasingly intertwined in the Second World War. Operation Mincemeat represented not just an imaginative ruse, but a calculated attempt to manipulate enemy decision-making through precision and detail, anticipation of psychological biases, and exploitation of geopolitical fears. By late April 1943, with preparations complete and the corpse delivered to Huelva, the Allied planners waited to see whether their careful design would achieve its intended effect. The redirection of Axis resources away from Sicily and toward false fronts in the Mediterranean. The first engagements of Operation Mincemeat were not fought with weapons on battlefields, but rather with documents, suspicions, and competing assessments inside intelligence networks. Once HMS Seraph released the corpse of Major William Martin off the coast of Huelva on 30 April 1943, the operation shifted into a phase in which the behavior of local officials, the Spanish authorities, and the German intelligence services would determine its outcome. This stage can be described as the clash between Allied deception and Axis evaluation, a contest in which each decision carried consequences for troop movements and strategic deployments. The body washed ashore on the morning of 1st May 1943, discovered by Spanish fishermen who promptly notified local authorities. Spain's government under Francisco Franco maintained a policy of neutrality, but its internal politics leaned towards sympathy for the Axis. German intelligence networks were firmly established, and Spanish officials often cooperated discreetly with them. In Huelva, the German vice consul Adolf Klaus had cultivated close ties with officials, making the region a hub of Abwehr activity. Thus, British planners had correctly predicted that any sensitive discovery would likely reach German hands. The Spanish coroner's examination of the body confirmed the identity presented by the false documents: a British officer who had drowned following an air crash. The briefcase secured to the corpse became the focal point. Spanish authorities initially informed the British embassy in Madrid of the discovery, triggering a careful response. The British ambassador, Sir Samuel Hoare, was instructed by London to press for the briefcase's return, but in a manner that appeared concerned yet not suspiciously urgent. This was designed to reinforce the perception that the documents were genuine and of critical importance to Allied operations. While negotiations unfolded, German agents pressed their Spanish contacts to access the material. Spanish officials, balancing neutrality with Axis sympathies, allowed the briefcase to be photographed. Microfilm copies of the documents were quickly dispatched to Berlin through the Abwehr network. By early May, German intelligence analysts in Berlin were studying the supposed correspondence between Allied generals, which outlined an invasion plan focused on Greece and Sardinia. The clash between deception and evaluation now intensified. Within German command circles, reactions were mixed. The Abwehr, led by Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, presented the documents as authentic. Abwehr officers argued that the level of detail, the apparent informality of the correspondence, and the consistency of the personal effects all indicated genuineness. The German Foreign Office, receiving similar reports from Madrid, supported this view. The Luftwaffe and naval intelligence also considered the information plausible, since Allied air and naval bases in North Africa were suitably positioned to support landings in the eastern Mediterranean. However, skepticism existed within the Wehrmacht's High Command, OKW. Some staff officers noted that Sicily remained the most logical target due to geography. The island's proximity to North Africa and its importance for controlling Mediterranean sea routes could not be ignored. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commander of German forces in the Mediterranean, warned that Sicily could not be discounted. Yet Adolf Hitler himself leaned toward believing the documents, influenced by long-standing fears of an Allied attack on the Balkans, which he considered strategically vital for protecting Romanian oil fields and maintaining control over southeastern Europe. For the Allies, monitoring these developments required indirect channels. British intelligence could not confirm immediately whether the deception had succeeded, but intercepts from the ultra-code-breaking program began to provide clues. Signals decrypted at Bletchley Park indicated German concern about Greece and Sardinia, with orders to redeploy some units accordingly. This was the first evidence that Operation Mincemeat had begun to shape enemy planning. Civilian impacts in Spain also formed part of this initial phase. Rumors spread in Huelva about the drowned British officer, and local newspapers mentioned the discovery in passing. For Spanish civilians, the incident appeared minor compared to the broader hardships of wartime shortages, but for intelligence agencies, it was a significant moment. Fishermen and local officials found themselves drawn into an international deception operation without realizing their role in shaping Mediterranean strategy. Meanwhile, the British ambassador's carefully calibrated protests in Madrid strengthened the illusion. Sir Samuel Hoare made repeated measured demands for the return of the documents, presenting the impression that the British government was anxious about a severe security breach. These protests were duly reported by German intelligence, reinforcing their conviction that the material was real. By mid-May, German assessments reached Hitler's headquarters. The Führer issued instructions to reinforce defenses in Greece and the Balkans, including the transfer of the experienced 1st Panzer Division to the region. Sardinia also received additional attention, with fortifications strengthened and Luftwaffe units deployed. In contrast, Sicily, though still garrisoned by Axis troops, did not receive the full reinforcements that would have been allocated had the Germans believed it was the primary target. The early confrontations of Operation Mincemeat thus played out through a chain of discoveries, negotiations, and intelligence evaluations. The Allies had initiated the deception. Spanish authorities had cooperated indirectly. German agents had transmitted the information, and Hitler had made decisions based on it. This interplay produced real shifts in Axis deployments. The engagements were not measured in territory gained or lost, but in divisions moved, fortifications strengthened, and perceptions altered. For the Germans, the unexpected outcome of these first clashes was a distortion of their strategic priorities. Instead of concentrating defenses where the Allies intended to land, they diverted valuable formations to secondary theaters. For the Allies, the outcome was the validation of deception as a tool of warfare, demonstrating that carefully constructed details could influence decisions at the highest level of the enemy command structure. The initial phase of Operation Mincemeat therefore succeeded in setting the conditions for the larger invasion of Sicily, transforming intelligence trickery into a force with consequences equal to conventional combat. As Operation Mincemeat unfolded through May and June 1943, the deception entered its stage of escalation, where its consequences expanded far beyond the Spanish coast and began to influence strategic deployments across the Mediterranean. The escalation was not defined by combat losses or advancing front lines, but by the movement of divisions, the redirection of supplies, and the reshaping of Axis defensive priorities. At the same time, it produced crises of confidence and command on both sides, as German planners weighed incomplete intelligence, and Allied leaders wondered whether their ruse would truly hold until the invasion of Sicily commenced. The documents recovered from Major William Martin had been photographed and transmitted to Berlin by early May. Their analysis coincided with an already volatile strategic situation. The Axis had lost North Africa, with the surrender of nearly 25,000 German and Italian troops in Tunisia. This freed up Allied forces, numbering over 16,000 men with significant air and naval assets, for a new offensive. From the German perspective, it was certain that an Allied invasion of Europe's southern flank was imminent, but the precise location remained contested within the High Command. By mid-May, Hitler had reviewed the intelligence from Spain. The supposed correspondence, supported by diplomatic reports and Abwehr assessments, convinced him that Greece represented the main Allied target. On 12th of May, he issued orders to strengthen forces in the Balkans. German divisions, already stretched thin, were shifted accordingly. The 1st Panzer Division, a mobile formation critical to any defensive effort, was sent to Greece. Additional units were moved into the Peloponnese and Crete, while air squadrons were redeployed to cover potential invasion beaches along the Aegean. This diversion of resources created escalating challenges for German logistics. Moving divisions across occupied Europe required rail capacity, fuel allocations, and shipping protection. Each transfer strained an already overburdened supply system. The Italian military, tasked with defending much of the Mediterranean coastline, also reacted to German assessments. Sardinia received new coastal artillery emplacements, reinforced garrisons, and construction of additional defensive works. Italian commanders in Rome, faced with shortages of manpower and equipment, were frustrated at the necessity of dispersing their forces across multiple islands, rather than concentrating them where an invasion seemed most likely. For the Allies, the escalation phase brought signs of both success and risk. Intelligence intercepts at Bletchley Park revealed German communications confirming reinforcements to Greece and Sardinia. Ultra-decrypts showed that by early June, several divisions had been shifted eastward, leaving Sicily with fewer armored reserves than Allied planners had feared. Yet the Allies also understood that if German intelligence uncovered the deception too soon, reinforcements could be redirected back to Sicily, undermining the operation. Maintaining secrecy and credibility remained vital until the invasion fleet was underway. Meanwhile, within German command circles, debates intensified. Field Marshal Kesselring, commanding German forces in Italy, continued to warn that Sicily's geography and strategic position made it the logical Allied target. He urged Berlin not to weaken the island's defenses. Yet his recommendations were undercut by Hitler's conviction that the Major Martin documents proved otherwise. The result was an uneven defensive posture. While Sicily retained a substantial garrison of around 300,000 Italian and German troops, including the Hermann Göring Panzer Division, key reinforcements that could have bolstered the island were instead sent elsewhere. Civilian populations in the Mediterranean also felt the effects of the escalation. In Greece, local communities witnessed the arrival of new German units, requisitioning of supplies, and intensified fortification projects. These measures added to the hardships already imposed by occupation, including food shortages and forced labor. In Sardinia, construction of new defenses disrupted agricultural work and required the mobilization of local labor under Italian military authority. For civilians, the war's escalation was experienced less as combat and more as the deepening demands of military preparation, resource extraction, and occupation policies. For the Allies, logistical preparations for the actual invasion of Sicily continued under the protection of the Deception. Operation Husky involved over 3,000 ships, 14 divisions, and more than 18,000 troops. Air superiority was established through the deployment of thousands of aircraft to North Africa and Malta. The diversion of Axis attention meant that many of these movements could take place with reduced risk of concentrated enemy counteraction. Deception was not a substitute for logistics, but it magnified the effectiveness of Allied preparations by lowering the intensity of enemy focus on Sicily. Political tensions also accompanied this stage. In Berlin, Hitler's decisions to divert resources eastward frustrated some commanders, who argued that the available divisions were insufficient to cover all potential targets simultaneously. In Rome, Italian leaders grew increasingly anxious. Mussolini's regime faced declining morale at home, with bombing raids on Italian cities, food shortages, and rising dissent. The diversion of resources to Sardinia and Greece, rather than strengthening Sicily, fueled discontent within the Italian military leadership, who recognized the island's vulnerability. By late June, the escalation phase had produced a paradoxical situation. German and Italian defenses were stronger in regions that the Allies had no intention of attacking, while Sicily, though still heavily defended, lacked the reinforcement that would have made the invasion far more costly. The Deception had reached its critical point. It had successfully altered Axis deployments, but now everything depended on whether the ruse would hold long enough to ensure that reinforcements could not be shifted back in time. The crisis was one of timing and conviction. If the Germans remained convinced that Greece was the target, the Allies would achieve surprise and secure a foothold in Sicily. If doubts spread too early, the entire Deception would unravel. Thus, by the eve of the invasion in early July 1943, the escalation of Operation Mincemeat had reshaped Axis strategy, consumed critical resources, and set the stage for a confrontation that would determine the next phase of the Mediterranean War. The documents carried by a single fabricated officer had now influenced the deployment of tens of thousands of soldiers across multiple fronts, illustrating how deception could escalate into a force as consequential as traditional military operations. The peak of Operation Mincemeat's impact coincided with the final preparations and execution of Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily in July 1943. By this stage, the Deception had run its full course, influencing Axis deployments across the Mediterranean and directly shaping the conditions under which the landings would unfold. It was the culmination of months of planning, subtle diplomatic maneuvering, and carefully orchestrated disinformation, all converging on the decisive test of whether the Germans would act on the false intelligence they had received. On 9 July 1943, the Allied invasion force set sail from North Africa and Malta. It represented the largest amphibious operation attempted up to that point in the war, around 16,000 men, supported by more than 3,000 ships and landing craft, as well as 4,000 aircraft providing cover and transport. The operation brought together American, British, and Canadian divisions, coordinated under the overall command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower. British General Bernard Montgomery's 8th Army landed on the southeastern sector of the island, while Lieutenant General George S. Patton's 7th Army targeted beaches to the west. The Germans, by contrast, had thinned their forces in Sicily while reinforcing other regions. Ultra-intercepts and post-war records confirmed that Hitler had ordered the transfer of the 1st Panzer Division and other experienced formations to Greece, Crete, and the Balkans. Sardinia also received additional troops and fortifications. In total, between 4 and 6 divisions that might otherwise have been concentrated in Sicily were dispersed elsewhere. The garrison of Sicily still numbered approximately 300,000, including Italian coastal defense troops, the Livorno Division, and the German Hermann Göring Panzer Division, but their overall composition reflected a weaker balance of mobile reserves than initially planned. As the invasion fleet approached, weather and sea conditions created difficulties. A violent storm on the night of 9 to 10 July disrupted airborne operations, scattering American and British paratroopers and causing heavy losses among glider units. Despite these setbacks, the amphibious landings achieved relative surprise. Axis defenders were not fully concentrated at the beaches chosen by the Allies, in part because German command remained uncertain about whether Sicily was the main target. Reports from Abwehr agents in Spain and Italy still warned of potential operations in Greece and the eastern Mediterranean, and German intelligence considered the Sicilian assault possibly a diversion to mask a larger attack elsewhere. The initial battles on Sicily's shores highlighted the consequences of Operation Mincemeat. At Gela, American forces faced counterattacks from elements of the Hermann Göring Panzer Division, which nearly drove them back into the sea. Naval gunfire support proved decisive in repelling these thrusts. British and Canadian forces at Piceno and Syracuse encountered less resistance, as Italian coastal divisions surrendered or retreated under pressure. The balance of Axis defenses, already undermined by diversionary deployments, prevented a unified response. Civilian populations on Sicily experienced the full force of the invasion. Air raids on ports and communications centers intensified in the days preceding the landings, causing extensive damage in Catania, Messina, and Palermo. Thousands of civilians fled inland or sought refuge in the countryside. As Allied troops advanced, they encountered mixed reactions. Some civilians welcomed the occupiers in the hope of relief from fascist rule and wartime hardship, while others were caught in the destruction of their towns and villages. At the peak of the campaign, German and Italian command structures struggled to coordinate. Communications between Rome, Berlin, and frontline commanders were hampered by air raids and disrupted lines. Italian morale was faltering, and reports reached Mussolini of widespread desertions. German commanders, including Kesselring, attempted to stabilize the defense by rushing reinforcements from mainland Italy. But these units arrived piecemeal and could not reverse the strategic imbalance created by earlier redeployments. The human cost of this peak phase was considerable. By the end of July, Axis losses on Sicily included over 3,000 killed or wounded, and more than 14,000 taken prisoner, the majority Italian troops. Allied casualties, though lower, still numbered more than 2,000, including thousands of paratroopers lost during the airborne operations. These figures underscored the scale of the campaign and the decisive impact of the conditions shaped by deception and preparation. Politically, the invasion triggered immediate repercussions in Italy. The fall of Sicily undermined confidence in Mussolini's leadership, leading to his arrest on 25 July 1943 and the collapse of fascist control in Rome. The Italian government soon entered secret negotiations with the Allies, culminating in the Armistice of September. Operation Mincemeat thus indirectly contributed not only to military success, but also to political upheaval within the Axis alliance. For the Germans, the peak of the campaign was marked by realization that they had miscalculated. Despite warnings from some commanders, Hitler's belief in the authenticity of the Major Martin documents had contributed to the dispersal of forces and the weakening of Sicily's defense. By the time reinforcements were redirected, it was too late to prevent the Allies from securing a foothold on the island. The Wehrmacht now faced the prospect of defending mainland Italy with fewer divisions and diminishing resources. Operation Mincemeat reached its maximum influence during these weeks. The convergence of deception, logistics, and battlefield realities demonstrated how non-combat operations could alter the outcome of major campaigns. The peak was not defined only by the intensity of the fighting on Sicily, but also by the strategic consequences that rippled across Europe. Italy destabilized, Germany forced onto the defensive, and the Mediterranean firmly in Allied hands. This represented the high point of the deception's effect, confirming that the gambit of a single fabricated officer's papers had decisively influenced the course of the Mediterranean War. As the invasion of Sicily progressed into late July 1943, the dynamics of Operation Mincemeat entered a phase of resistance and adaptation. For the Allies, this meant adjusting to Axis countermeasures, sustaining momentum despite logistical challenges, and consolidating their deception gains. For the Germans and Italians, it involved a belated recognition of their miscalculations and hurried attempts to adapt defensive strategies in the face of collapsing positions. The battle for Sicily became the proving ground for how deception, combined with operational flexibility, shaped the wider Mediterranean War. On the Axis side, the initial shock of the Allied landings gave way to attempts at organized resistance. German commanders, particularly General Hans Valentin Hube, who was given responsibility for German forces on Sicily, sought to stabilize defenses by concentrating surviving units in the northeastern part of the island. The Hermann Göring Panzer Division and the newly arrived 15th Panzer Grenadier Division mounted counterattacks around Catania and along the Etna line. Italian units, though heavily demoralized, also resisted in localized engagements, especially coastal artillery batteries and remnants of the Livorno Division. Yet the cohesion of Axis resistance was undermined by diverging priorities. German units sought to preserve combat strength for a potential evacuation, while Italian forces faced crumbling morale, mass surrenders, and open desertions. Adaptation on the German side also meant reinforcing mainland Italy. Recognizing that Sicily might fall, Kesselring ordered the preparation of defensive lines in Calabria, supported by the transfer of additional divisions from northern Italy. Luftwaffe units were redeployed to cover the Strait of Messina, providing fighter protection for evacuation operations. This shift demonstrated how Axis strategy had moved from counterattack to managed withdrawal, a recognition that Sicily could not be held indefinitely. For the Allies, adaptation meant overcoming the natural and logistical challenges of the campaign. The mountainous terrain of central Sicily limited the use of mechanized forces and forced infantry divisions into slow, grinding advances. Supply lines stretched across the Mediterranean, requiring constant naval escort to protect convoys from air and submarine attacks. Despite these difficulties, Allied commanders adjusted their tactics by exploiting naval superiority to launch amphibious end runs along the Sicilian coast, bypassing strongpoints and outflanking Axis defenders. Patton's 7th Army advanced rapidly toward Palermo by mid-July, while Montgomery's 8th Army pressed along the eastern axis toward Catania. Operation Mincemeat's effects were still visible during this period. German intelligence remained uncertain about Allied intentions beyond Sicily. Reports from Abwehr agents continued to warn of possible landings in Greece, leading to the maintenance of German forces in the Balkans, even as Sicily's situation deteriorated. This inability to redeploy quickly reflected the enduring credibility of the deception. Allied signals intercepts confirmed that by late July, several divisions remained tied down in Greece and Sardinia, divisions that might otherwise have reinforced the Axis defense of Sicily. Civilian populations across Sicily experienced the adaptation phase as a mixture of liberation and hardship. As Allied forces advanced, thousands of civilians welcomed them in hopes of relief from fascist rule and food shortages. Yet, the fighting brought destruction to towns and villages caught in the path of artillery bombardments and airstrikes. In Palermo, bomb damage compounded by naval gunfire left much of the city in ruins, while in Catania, the prolonged battle caused mass displacement. Civilians also faced requisitioning of supplies by both retreating Axis forces and advancing Allies, making survival precarious. The psychological toll on soldiers was equally profound. German troops, many of whom had fought since the early years of the war, recognized that their situation was untenable, but fought stubbornly to delay the Allied advance. Italian soldiers faced a collapse of confidence in Mussolini's leadership, and reports noted entire units refusing to fight. Allied soldiers, though buoyed by successes, also endured the strain of constant combat in rugged terrain under extreme summer heat. Casualties mounted steadily on both sides. By the end of July, Allied losses had exceeded 2,000 killed, wounded, or missing, while Axis losses were higher, with tens of thousands captured in addition to battlefield casualties. Innovation became a hallmark of this stage. The Germans employed skillful rearguard tactics, using demolitions and delaying actions to slow the Allied advance. Bridges were destroyed, roads mined, and defensive positions constructed along ridgelines. The Allies, in turn, relied on engineering units to clear obstacles, repair infrastructure, and maintain the pace of supply. Allied air power also adapted to the campaign by targeting Axis evacuation routes, particularly the ferry lines across the Strait of Messina, though with limited success. Politically, the adaptation period coincided with dramatic developments in Italy itself. On 25 July, Benito Mussolini was removed from power by the fascist Grand Council and arrested. Marshal Pietro Badoglio assumed leadership, publicly promising continued alliance with Germany, but secretly opening channels to negotiate an armistice with the Allies. This political shift reflected the collapse of Italian capacity to sustain the war and intensified the strain on German forces, who now faced the prospect of defending Italy without reliable Italian support. By early August, the resistance on Sicily had coalesced around the northeastern corner of the island, particularly the Etna Line, where German forces attempted to hold open evacuation routes. The Allies adapted by concentrating overwhelming artillery and air bombardments, while preparing amphibious operations to outflank these positions. This interplay of resistance and adaptation defined the final weeks of the campaign, Germans delaying and withdrawing systematically, Italians collapsing under pressure, and Allies adjusting their operations to secure the island with minimal further delay. In retrospect, this phase demonstrated how Operation Mincemeat continued to exert influence even after the initial landings. German decisions to hold forces in Greece and Sardinia, combined with their shift to defensive adaptation in Sicily, confirmed that the deception had not merely succeeded in shaping the start of the campaign, but had also prolonged its effects throughout. The battle for Sicily illustrated how resistance on the ground and adaptation in strategy were both shaped by a deception operation that had begun months earlier with a single body off the coast of Spain. The endurance of that deception allowed the Allies to press their advantage, while the Axis struggled to resist with insufficient resources and faltering political cohesion. The turning point of Operation Mincemeat's influence came in the first half of August 1943, when the consequences of the deception, the realities of combat in Sicily, and the collapse of Italian political stability converged to reshape the course of the Mediterranean War. At this stage, the initial question, whether the Germans would believe the false documents, was no longer in doubt. By August, Axis deployments clearly reflected the deception's impact, but the turning point lay in how these misallocations interacted with military and political events to produce irreversible outcomes. On the battlefield, the Allies advanced steadily across Sicily. By early August, Patton's 7th Army had captured Palermo, cutting off western Sicily, while Montgomery's 8th Army pressed hard against the Etna Line. The German Debusticino Panzer Corps, consisting of the Hermann Göring Division and the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, mounted fierce rearguard actions to delay the Allies, but their objective was no longer to hold Sicily outright. Instead, German command focused on preserving combat strength for evacuation to mainland Italy. This shift reflected recognition that the defense of the island had become untenable. Operation Mincemeat's effect was evident in the fact that reinforcements from Greece and Sardinia did not arrive. German forces there remained in place, guarding against invasions that never came. Ultra-decrypts confirmed that Hitler continued to regard the Balkans as a primary Allied target well into August, even as Sicily collapsed. This misallocation meant that only limited reserves were available to contest the Allied advance, leaving the defenders outnumbered and outgunned. The Italian position, already fragile, reached its breaking point. The fall of Mussolini on 25 July and his replacement by Marshal Pietro Badoglio marked a decisive political shift. While the new government publicly pledged to continue fighting alongside Germany, it secretly began negotiations with the Allies. Italian units on Sicily, already demoralized, largely abandoned the fight. By the time German commanders organized the evacuation, most Italian troops had either surrendered or deserted, accelerating the collapse of Axis defenses. For civilians, the turning point was experienced in both liberation and destruction. Towns in eastern Sicily, such as Catania and Messina, suffered extensive bombardments as the Allies sought to break German defenses and block evacuation routes. Thousands of civilians were displaced, food shortages deepened, and infrastructure collapsed. Yet in other areas, the arrival of Allied troops ended years of fascist rule, bringing new administrative structures, relief supplies, and the promise of stability. The contrast between hardship and relief reflected the dual impact of war and occupation. For the Allies, the turning point confirmed that deception could yield operational dividends far greater than expected. By tying down German divisions in Greece and Sardinia, Mincemeat reduced the scale of opposition on Sicily, enabling the Allies to achieve victory within 5 weeks of landing. By 17th August, the last German units evacuated across the Strait of Messina, leaving Sicily entirely in Allied hands. The rapid conclusion of the campaign, compared to the drawn-out battles in North Africa, underscored the role deception had played in tilting the balance. For Germany, the turning point was marked by a painful recognition of error. Even as their forces withdrew in good order, Hitler and the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht understood that they had been misled. The loss of Sicily exposed southern Italy to invasion, undermined confidence in Italian reliability, and forced Germany to commit more divisions to defend the peninsula. The Balkan forces that had been held back under false assumptions would now have to be redeployed under pressure, stretching German resources further. The repercussions of this turning point were immediate and far-reaching. On 3rd September, the Allies landed in Calabria, beginning the Italian campaign. On the same day, Italy signed an armistice with the Allies, which was publicly announced on 8th September. German forces swiftly moved to occupy Italy, disarm Italian troops, and establish defensive lines, but the strategic initiative in the Mediterranean had passed irreversibly to the Allies. Thus, the turning point of Operation Mincemeat was not a single moment, but a convergence. The Allies securing Sicily, the Germans trapped by false assumptions, and the Italians breaking away from the Axis alliance. The deception had achieved its maximum effect, directly shaping decisions that influenced not only the campaign in Sicily, but the broader strategic trajectory of the war in southern Europe. The aftermath of Operation Mincemeat unfolded in the weeks following the conclusion of the Sicilian campaign in mid-August 1943. Its consequences were not confined to the battlefield, but extended into the political, diplomatic, and humanitarian dimensions of the war. For the Allies, the deception had accomplished its immediate goal. It had diverted German resources away from Sicily, reduced the strength of Axis defenses on the island, and enabled a successful invasion that led directly to Italy's withdrawal from the Axis alliance. For the Axis powers, the aftermath was a sequence of retreats, reorganizations, and crises that reshaped their position in the Mediterranean. The immediate military aftermath was the evacuation of German forces from Sicily. Between 11 and 17th August 1943, under the direction of General Hube, the Germans organized one of the most efficient withdrawals of the war. Using ferries and barges across the Strait of Messina, they evacuated more than 4,000 troops, 1,000 vehicles, and nearly all surviving heavy equipment. The evacuation was conducted under constant Allied air and artillery attack, but German rearguard tactics and anti-aircraft defenses ensured that losses were limited. The Italians, by contrast, largely disintegrated. More than 14,000 Italian soldiers surrendered during the campaign, and most of those remaining on Sicily were left behind during the evacuation. This contrast highlighted the divergent trajectories of the two Axis partners. Germany remained capable of disciplined military operations, while Italy's capacity for organized resistance had collapsed. For the civilian population of Sicily, the aftermath meant both relief and hardship. With the end of combat, Allied military government authorities, AMGOD, assumed control, introducing food distribution programs, re-establishing basic services, and attempting to restore order. Yet the devastation of infrastructure, roads, railways, bridges, and ports, made recovery slow. Bombing had destroyed much of Catania, Palermo, and Messina. Agricultural production, vital to Sicily's economy, had been disrupted by requisitions, combat damage, and the displacement of labor. Civilians faced shortages of food, medicine, and housing, while also navigating the transition from fascist rule to Allied occupation. The broader political consequences became clear almost immediately. On 25 July, even before the campaign ended, Mussolini had been deposed and arrested. By early September, the Badoglio government had signed an armistice with the Allies, publicly announced on 18 September. Italy's withdrawal from the war marked the most significant political upheaval in Europe since 1940, reshaping the balance of power in the Mediterranean. German forces responded by implementing Operation Achse, occupying Italy, disarming its army, and preparing to resist Allied advances up the peninsula. The collapse of Italy as an Axis partner was directly connected to the loss of Sicily, which in turn was facilitated by Operation Mincemeat's success in misdirecting Axis defenses. From the German perspective, the aftermath included both military and psychological repercussions. The failure to anticipate the Allied invasion of Sicily revealed flaws in the intelligence process. Although some commanders, notably Kesselring, had warned that Sicily remained the logical target, Hitler's decision to reinforce Greece and Sardinia reflected his reliance on the documents from Huelva. This misjudgment weakened German credibility within its own high command, sowing doubts about the reliability of Abwehr intelligence. In the following months, German counterintelligence operations were reviewed, and greater emphasis was placed on skepticism of captured documents. Nevertheless, the damage had been done. Resources had been misallocated at a critical juncture, and the Allies had gained the initiative in southern Europe. For the Allies, the immediate aftermath confirmed the value of deception as a strategic tool. Reports from ultra-intercepts demonstrated that German divisions remained pinned in Greece and the Balkans well after the fall of Sicily. Even in September, when the Allies landed in Calabria, significant Axis forces were still concentrated far from the actual front. This validated the investment in deception planning and encouraged further use of such operations, most notably in preparation for the Normandy invasion in 1944. Mincemeat thus became both a success in its own right and a template for future Allied strategy. The humanitarian dimension of the aftermath was profound. Sicily's civilian population, numbering around 4 million, endured shortages that persisted long after the fighting ceased. Allied bombing had destroyed water and power supplies, while the displacement of hundreds of thousands created a refugee crisis within the island. Disease spread in overcrowded conditions, and food rations often fell below subsistence levels. The Allied administration attempted to address these problems, but with resources focused on military operations, relief was limited. The population faced the dual challenges of survival and adapting to foreign occupation, which replaced one form of authoritarian control with another, albeit less repressive. At the same time, the aftermath had international repercussions. The fall of Sicily and the collapse of Mussolini were closely followed in both Allied and neutral countries. In Washington and London, the campaign was presented as evidence that the strategy of striking Europe's soft underbelly was working. In Ankara, Madrid, and Stockholm, neutral governments recalculated their positions, observing that Axis fortunes were declining. In Berlin, the loss of Italy as a partner forced Hitler to commit additional divisions to the Mediterranean, reducing resources available for the Eastern Front, at a time when the Battle of Kursk had already inflicted heavy losses. The withdrawal from Sicily also marked a transition point for the German military. Evacuated divisions regrouped in southern Italy, establishing defensive lines such as the Volturno and Gustav lines. These positions delayed the Allied advance for months, demonstrating that while the loss of Sicily was a setback, Germany retained the capacity to wage prolonged defensive warfare. Yet the initiative had passed irreversibly to the Allies, and the strategic consequences of Mincemeat ensured that Germany was now reacting to Allied moves rather than dictating the course of events. In summary, the aftermath of Operation Mincemeat was multidimensional. Militarily, it allowed the Allies to capture Sicily with fewer losses than might otherwise have occurred. Politically, it triggered the fall of Mussolini and Italy's withdrawal from the war. Humanitarian consequences included devastation for Sicily's population, whose recovery was slow and painful. Strategically, it validated deception as a cornerstone of Allied planning and forced Germany to fight a defensive war in southern Europe under increasingly unfavorable conditions. The body of Major Martin, delivered to the Spanish coast months earlier, had set in motion a chain of events whose consequences were now visible across the Mediterranean and beyond. The legacy of Operation Mincemeat extends far beyond the Mediterranean theater of 1943, shaping both the immediate trajectory of the war and the long-term understanding of deception in military history. In the short term, the operation achieved precisely what it set out to do. It convinced the German High Command that the Allies intended to strike Greece and Sardinia, not Sicily. This misdirection led to the redeployment of several divisions, including the experienced 1st Panzer Division, away from Sicily, leaving the island's defenses weaker than they might have been. The result was that Operation Husky succeeded more quickly, at lower cost, and with broader consequences than initially anticipated. Politically, the capture of Sicily and the fall of Mussolini represented one of the most significant outcomes of the deception. The removal of Italy as an effective Axis partner altered the balance of power in Europe. The new Italian government, under Marshal Pietro Badoglio, signed an armistice in September 1943, leading to German occupation of Italy and the opening of a new front in the peninsula. This outcome forced Germany to divert considerable resources to defend southern Europe at a time when the Eastern Front and the Western European coast also demanded troops and equipment. In this sense, the success of Operation Mincemeat indirectly accelerated the strain on German military capacity across multiple theaters. From a military perspective, the operation demonstrated the power of coordinated deception. The Allies did not rely solely on mincemeat, but integrated it into a broader deception framework known as Operation Barclay. This comprehensive approach combined diplomatic maneuvers, false radio traffic, and visible troop movements with the fabricated documents carried by Major William Martin. The success of mincemeat confirmed that deception could function as a decisive force multiplier, shaping enemy decisions as effectively as conventional firepower. It also provided a model later expanded upon in Operation Bodyguard, the deception plan for the Normandy invasion in 1944, which relied heavily on lessons learned from the Mediterranean campaign. The cultural and historical significance of mincemeat is equally notable. After the war, when details of the operation were revealed, it was widely studied as one of the most daring and unconventional intelligence successes of the conflict. It has since become a case study in military academies and intelligence schools, illustrating how creativity, attention to detail, and anticipation of enemy psychology can alter the course of operations. The story of a body carrying false documents, set adrift off Spain, captured public imagination as an example of how the smallest details can influence great events. For Germany, the legacy was more somber. The acceptance of the mincemeat documents as genuine highlighted vulnerabilities in German intelligence evaluation. While individual commanders such as Kesselring warned of the likelihood of an Allied assault on Sicily, their concerns were overridden by Hitler's conviction that the Balkans were the true target. This misjudgment undermined confidence in the Abwehr and contributed to internal disputes within the German command structure. In the long term, it reinforced the view that German decision-making was increasingly shaped by Hitler's preconceptions rather than balanced assessments of available intelligence. For Spain, the episode reflected the delicate balance of its neutrality. While Madrid maintained official non-belligerence, the willingness of local officials to cooperate with German agents revealed how Spanish territory served as an indirect battlefield for intelligence operations. The incident at Huelva highlighted how neutral states could be exploited by both sides in the struggle for information, raising broader questions about the role of neutrality in total war. Commemoration of Operation Mincemeat has taken many forms. Memorials exist for the man whose body was used, buried under the name of Major William Martin in Huelva, later identified as Glyndŵr Michael. His grave continues to be visited as a reminder of the unusual role he played in history. Scholarly works, declassified intelligence files, and cultural portrayals have ensured that the operation remains one of the most famous deception efforts of the Second World War. In historical debate, Operation Mincemeat is seen as a turning point in recognizing deception as a core element of Allied strategy. While its immediate tactical contribution was the facilitation of the Sicilian invasion, its broader legacy was the demonstration that war could be shaped not only by strength of arms, but also by manipulation of perception. By influencing Hitler's decisions at a crucial juncture, the operation indirectly reshaped the Mediterranean campaign, the politics of the Axis alliance, and the trajectory of the wider war. Its legacy remains an enduring testament to the decisive impact of intelligence in modern conflict.